What's up you phonies, how's it going? Welcome to another Blender tutorial. Today we're gonna work on this very cool but very simple Blender scene. As you can see in my scene, there's not that much going on. We have just a few objects. We have 4 planes for the walls. We have those little spikes here, which are cones, like you can see them right here, and also a few toruses, and that's basically it. Everything else is just lighting and the vision. I'm not saying this scene is the best scene ever made, but it's very cool to see how, with very little knowledge about 3D modeling, how you can make a scene like that. And I'm going to show you how. So without further ado, let's delete everything. Hit A, X, gone. Let's start from scratch. So the first thing we need is a room, a tunnel, or whatever you want. In my case, it's just a very long corridor, and I started with a plane. Let's zoom in on my little plane here. Let's bring this up to the end that it's really sitting on the ground, just to keep it simple. Now, when I look at top view, I want this to be around 20 meters. Like around 20 meters. Right now, this is 2 meters, so I'm adjusting the dimensions. So I just hit S, scale it up until it's like around 20 meters. There you go. Now, because we adjusted the scale, we're also going to apply the scale with Ctrl A and apply the scale. Now, just this wouldn't be very interesting, would it? So what we're going to do is extrude and insert a few of those squares, which are not squares yet because we need to subdivide it. For that, go to edit mode. I'm going to go back to top view, right click and subdivide. If I clicked away now, I would have 4 squares now. But I want more. Let's say the number of cuts is going to be 8. Let's say 10. Great. Now what I'm going to do is just select randomly a few of those faces, and you can do that randomly, or like me, you can pick them yourself depending on how random you want it. So I just selected all of them with holding shift, and now when I hit E on my keyboard, I can extrude a few of those faces up or down. In that case, I want them to go up. And while I have those selected, I can also hit Ctrl B and bevel the edges a little, because nothing is perfectly sharp, so I just bevel the edges a little. Perfect. Now, if I want to, I select a few more, and we could, like I said, you can do it random. I'm not going to do it random. It's going to make sense. Let's go back to top view so we see better. This one is not supposed to be selected. And now let's say we hit I to intersect, to make those a little smaller, and E maybe to go down a little. Cool. Now this is our model. Now having this alone is obviously not enough. What we need to do is go back to object mode and make a very long corridor out of this. And for that, I'm gonna use a modifier, an array modifier. Right now, it made a duplicate on the right side. I want it to go into the distance, the y-axis, so I'm gonna, factor x is gonna go to 0, factor y is gonna go on 1. Now it made me a perfect duplicate on the other side, but I don't want 1 or 2, I want 20. There you go. It just goes far into the distance, and that's exactly what I want. Now that alone would not be enough. What I need is a ceiling and 2 walls. And of course it looks a little boring, so I need to give it some kind of material. And I use Polyhaven for the material I did in my scene, but you can just make your own material. So let's do that. I'm gonna go on new in my shader editor, and look what we got here. We can just adjust manually. So I'm gonna turn up the metallic because I want it to be a little shiny. Make sure you are in the Eevee or Cycles viewport so you can actually see what you're doing. So I'm gonna go down with the roughness so I can see how shiny it is. Let's go to 50%, specular 50, and if we increase the roughness, it's just gonna make it a little rougher. But I think it's going to be more interesting if I make a noise texture. With Shift A, you can make a new node. I'm going to use the noise texture, connect this with my actual output. I can do that by holding Control, Shift, click on it. Now it just basically shows me what it looks like. And if I don't see enough, I can make another node, Shift A, a color ramp, connect this in between. And now if I increase the contrast here, bring the whites closer to the blacks and the blacks closer to the whites, I can see a little better. Now I'm going to increase the roughness, maybe even the detail, so it kind of looks like dirt or something like that. I could increase the distortion too, which I don't recommend usually, but you can. And of course we can adjust the scale if we want to. But it just basically looks like imperfections. Usually I would use imperfection maps for that, but since this is a YouTube tutorial and I want you to be able to follow along, let's just stick with that. Now, instead of plugging this into the material output, what we actually want, the principled volume goes into the surface of the output, and the color ramp here goes into the roughness. So what that's going to do, you might be able to see it, that it gives me some kind of reflections, weird reflections. It's very similar to my puddle tutorial. If you haven't seen my puddle tutorial yet, go check it out right here, because it's a very similar technique but a little different, and that's how you can make very cool puddles. And that just basically gives me a few imperfections. Highly recommend doing something like that. We can always come back to it if we want to adjust it. Let's say we want the color to be a little darker. Let's make it like a dark gray. Love it. Cool. Now, of course, we just have the ground. We need a ceiling and two walls. And for that, I'm going to hold Alt, D, duplicate it, hold Z, just bring it up. And let's turn it under the Y-axis 180 degrees. And that looks pretty cool. I'm going to hold Alt again, hit D, make another duplicate, hit R for the rotation, Y, and let's say 90 degrees. Bring this with G, Y, or in my case Z. Let's bring this to the side. One more time, hold Alt, D, R, Y, 180 degrees, and bring this to the left. Make sure it intersects with your ground and your ceiling, because you don't want any empty spaces here, so just double check that it's intersecting. Now our room here is done. What we now need is a camera which can go through all this. So hold Shift A, camera. Hover over your viewport where you want to see your camera through, which is, on my case, it's on the top. Hold Control 0 on the numpad. Now we're looking through the camera, and I'm going to bring it to the general position where I want my scene to start, which is somewhere around here. Cool. Under item, I'm making sure that it's actually exactly 90 degrees. This should be 0, this should be 0, so it's perfectly straight. Now let's go deeper in the camera settings. I don't want it to be 50mm, I want it to be 24mm lens. Just my personal taste, you don't have to do that, that's just what I want. While we're here, let's go to the Passepartout to turn this completely up. That's going to basically remove everything around what our camera doesn't see. It's just going to remove it, so the render is faster, and actually it helps me to see what is the camera actually capturing. Now while we're here, we can turn on depth of field. I don't have a focus object, or I just leave the focus distance at like 10 meters, so I can estimate around here is where the focus is going to be. 2.8 is fine, just for extra realism, because cameras usually do have a depth of field. Now the next step is, for me, I'm going to animate the camera, and I animated in my video, I animated the location, so it is going like this direction here to the front, but I also animated the Y rotation, and we're going to do that now. So let's start with the location. I hover over location, make sure you're on the first frame, hit I. It's going to generate keyframes for X, Y, and Z, but actually we only want Y. So I'm going to go to my objects, or to my keyframes rather. I keyframed. I'm going to delete the Z location and the X location, because I only want to animate the Y location. Go to my very last frame, and now change this number until we are in the end of the room, because that's how how far I want my camera to go, just like here. Now instead of hovering over location again, hitting I hover over my graph editor, hit I, make sure location is selected, hit I, and only selected channels. So now it generated keyframes from one to the other, and you can see how it's easing in and easing out. You might want that. I don't. I want the movement to be constant. So either I could just move those things, this one to the left, the other one to the right. It is easier to hover over your graph editor, hit T, and I'm just going to make it linear. So it's just moving constant in a constant speed through my scene. Okay, now it's time to animate the rotation. I'm going to do the same thing. Hover over rotation on the very first keyframe, on the very first frame. Hover over rotation, hit I. I only want the Y rotation. So I'm gonna remove the Z rotation, the X rotation, select your Y rotation, go to the very last frame, and let's say we want to spin it 2 times, 720 degrees. Hover over your graph editor, hit I, only selected channel, and now it's going to start spinning. And again, we have this ease, it's easing into it, which is cool. I like that. It's fast, 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 and then eventually it slows down. You might want that. I don't. I want it to ease into it as slow as possible, but not easing out. I want it to just get faster, faster, faster. So I move this one, this easer here, easer, I don't know if that's what it's called, but I just select it, hit G, X, and I move this to the right. I select the first keyframe here and bring this one as right as I can, like this. That means it starts slow, it starts rotating very slowly, and it's getting faster, 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 until it's like just spinning, and then it just cuts to black or white or whatever color you want. Great, now that our camera movement is done, we can see what else we can add to our scene. Most importantly, and I always say that, start with your lighting. Camera and lights first, because then you actually know what you're going to see and where you have to put more details into it. So let's make some lights. And here it really depends if you're rendering in Eevee or in cycles. I rendered in cycles because we're going to have a bunch of area lights, but you could also use an emissive material in case you use cycles. But we're just gonna, just in case everybody's working with Eevee here, let's use area lights. So Shift A, make a light, area light. Just down here, we're gonna bring it up to the ceiling, and zoom a little closer so we know where it is. That's cool. Now we're gonna scale it up along the X axis until it hits the walls. Now let's watch through cycles. That's what we're seeing right now, which is not much. Let's increase the strength a little, and there's light. And in my video I used red light, but it's just because it's my YouTube tutorial here. Let's make it pink. And we can adjust also the spread if you want it to be smaller or bigger. Let's keep it smaller. A matter of taste, you can do whatever you want. And we're gonna have to adjust the strength of the light eventually a little more once we have haze in our scene, but that's okay because right now we're not making different lights. We're just going to use one light a bunch of times. So we're going to go to top view. Let's turn on X-ray view so we can actually see through here. And now we're just going to make a bunch of copies, or instances rather. So hold Alt D, that made an instance, hit Y so we can actually move it further out. It's really up to you how often you want to show them, and let's duplicate a bunch of those. More or less the same distance. If there was an array, then it would be the exact same distance, which I would prefer, but we're working with actual lights right now, and you cannot make arrays with lights. So we're just going to duplicate them by hand until we're in the end of the room. Great, now when we look through it, we can see the camera is zooming through all this cool stuff here. Looks pretty badass, right? Now what else I did was I had by the end of my room, let's see, where's my beginning, where's the end? This is the beginning, okay. In the end of my room, I had another plane. So Shift A, Mesh, Plane, and rotate it towards the camera, so x-axis in my case, 90 degrees, scale it up. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's the only purpose is once the camera is like so far that we can't see the outside, because that would be just pitch black, and we don't want that. So let's have some kind of, let's make it a material. We can make it metallic, low roughness, so it's gonna be like a little mirror in the end. Whatever, it doesn't matter. It's because it's already gonna be blown out. Now what else I'm adding here is a very, very strong light source, a spotlight. Let's bring it up, rotate it towards the camera. Make sure it's not behind the wall. It has to be inside the room. Let's turn off X-ray view. Yeah, it's inside the room. Let's turn it up, right, shining into the camera. Great. Now this one, like I said, has to be very, very strong. Again, we're gonna adjust all the lights once the haze is set, but for now that'll do. So now when we go to the very first frame, we have this light in the end of the tunnel, which is super cool, and especially through the haze, it's gonna look pretty badass. Now, what else did I do? Let's go to the very first frame. Let's find our camera, which is right here. If you don't know how to find your objects, you can just click on your object in your list here, like the camera, or let's say this area light, and hold the delete button or the dot on my numpad, and the camera zooms into my particular object. So I want to go to my camera, click on it, hover to whatever window I want to use, hit the dot, and my viewport is going to jump to that. Now, what I else want to add, that's what I did in my scene, was a bunch of toruses. I'm going to rotate them towards the camera 90 degrees, bring it up. Let's bring this one close to the camera so I know exactly where it's going to be. I want it to go right through the center, like that. Right click, shade smooth. Now you could just give it a random material, just like I did with the ground. But in my case, what I did is make it hazy, that this is basically like haze floating around. The way I'm going to do that is go on new, make it a new material. We're going to delete my principal BSDF. We don't need it. Use a volume scatter instead. Connect this with the volume. So now you can see it is a little transparent, because what it does is change this to 0.6. It's gonna use the light from the background within, it's basically like haze, within the object, and that way it looks pretty cool. You can adjust your density the way you want it. Also, it's going to be important to adjust those things once we have haze throughout the scene, but that'll do for now. And now we can make it even a little more interesting. Let's say we want the same thing what we did with the ground earlier, using a noise texture, and define the density with the noise texture. So right now, without any settings, that's what it would look like. It's hard to say what it actually does. That's why I'm actually connecting my noise texture with the surface, so I actually see what it actually would be doing, just the noise texture. Make sure to apply the scale of your object if you changed it. Now I can play with the scale, the detail, roughness, more or less, distortion, sure, why not, until you like what you see. Now of course it's always hard to imagine what it's actually going to look like, but if you want to see what it looks like, just connect the volume scatter back to the material output, and then you know what it looks like. We can also, instead of 3D, we're going to make it 4D, and we can animate the W value. Hover over W, hit I, go to the last frame, change the W value to 1, for example. Hover over W, hit I, and now when we look at this, let's turn this off, let's look only through here. Now we can see that this is actually changing. So it's like some kind of magic portal thing or something. I don't know. But yeah, that's pretty cool. Now just make sure you connect your noise texture with your volume scatter, the volume scatter with the volume of your material output. And then when you are in cycles, this is what it looks like. And the camera is going to be zooming through it. But now, of course, we don't just want one, we want a bunch of those. And remember the modifier we used earlier? We use it again, array modifier. And again, we don't want it to go towards the x-axis, we want it to go towards y. Actually, for some reason we need it to go towards z, negative z. Not sure why, I probably changed some orientation here. And now we're just gonna make, let's say 10. Now we can turn up, or in that case down, the distance. So we're gonna go to top view and make sure those reach to the far back of our scene. I can see very little here. This is where it goes. And if I wanted more, I could just adjust this number, and now while we're going through our scene, we have all those circles where the camera is perfectly gonna go through because we adjusted the camera angle in the beginning. And that's a very trippy effect. And now the last thing we need to do is, now I made a few more objects just to keep it more interesting coming out of the ground. And what I did was I hold Shift A, mesh, and a cone. Let's zoom in where our cone is. I'm gonna adjust the size a little. I want it to be more spiky. I'm also gonna add a subdivision surface, let's say 2. And I like this look, so basically they're gonna come out of the ground. And let's start with those in the very beginning of where the camera starts, so we have have an idea where it is and what it looks like. Okay, they're gonna come out of the ground like this. Let's shade smooth those. Also, let's give it a material. Let's make it black-ish, almost black, metallic. That'll do. Now I'm gonna go to the point where I want it to be completely out, so this is like the end position, and I'm gonna make a few duplicates, spread them randomly, even like the size can be a little different. Make another one, let's say here, smaller, make another one of those, this, make it a little bigger. But what I don't want is that the camera is going directly through it, so this one I'm gonna move a little, like let's say here. And now I'm going to select all the 4 cones I made, hold Ctrl and J. Now it's going to make it one object. So I select one and all of them are moving. And guess what? We're going to make another array. So go on your modifiers, add modifiers, array, and I want them to go towards, here it works again, the y-axis, how many do I want? Want them to spread out, go to top view, make sure I have them till the end. So let's do a few more. 15. Perfect. Perfect guess. So now when the camera is zooming through it, that's where they are. They're going to be throughout the entire scene. But, you know, I don't want them to be out through the entire scene. I want them to come into the shot. So it's some kind of trap coming together, or whatever we're inside trying to get to the camera guy, or the first person. So what we're going to do is, this is going to be our last frame. The position of those things are going to be like this in our last frame. So I'm going to go to my last one, hover over location, hit I, and again delete my, I believe it's Y location, delete X location. Now I'm going to go to my very first frame and move the Z location down, that it's going to be out of the ground. Hover over location, over my graph editor, hit I, only select the channels. So now slowly they're going to come out of the ground. And those two, I want them to be linear. So I hit T, linear, and now I have a linear graph. Amazing. Now this light here has to be a little lower because I want it to be on camera height. I'm going to just move it a little lower, basically right into the center. That's where I want it. Great. And now the last step is, at least for me, you can go on as much as you want, but for me, just explaining this, if this video wasn't edited, that would have taken 40 minutes to make this when I'm checking the time. So really, to make a scene like this would take 20 minutes, maybe. And again, this is a very basic environment, so you can go nuts if you want to. So the last thing is what I always love to do is, like, I make a new object, a cube. This is my cube here. I'm going to bring it to the center. Make this the size of my room, like this. Let's go to this view, basically same size, because you want those volume cubes. You don't want them to be too big because they do take a lot of render time. So you just try to keep them as small as possible, as big as necessary. So I just went through side view. This is my box now. I'm gonna make it as long as my scene has to be. Let's go to side view, so basically like that. And now we're gonna give this also a new material, delete the principal BSDF, give it a volume scatter, connect this with your volume, adjust this number to 0.6 because that's the right, what this number does is basically how much light it takes from the backside, from how it's backlit, and the density is like how dense your scene is going to be, or how dense your haze is going to be. And around 0.01 is usually good. If you want it hazier, then you can go to 0.1, but it's really up to you. Just check your renders, make sure to render a frame sometimes. And under your noise thresholds, my noise threshold was 1.0, which is very high, but for such a fast scene, it'll do. But if you have a very good computer, you can go a lot lower. To 0.01 is the best I would use. I wouldn't go lower than that. 0.1 usually does the trick, but with haze especially, you want to keep this number lower. While we're at the render settings, make sure to have enough volume and transmission and transparency, because we have a lot of haze here. We have lots of things we want to look through, so make sure to have enough bounces here. Make sure to turn on motion blur, because that is going to give us a very cool effect. I'm turning on fast GI approximation because it just renders way faster. And make sure here and there render a frame, so you're actually going to see what the render is going to look like when it's done. And the cool thing is, let's turn on our haze cube for now. If you want to adjust your actual model, like your room for example, if you want to add more details, you can easily do that, because we were working with instances and arrays. So whatever we change now, let's go to edit mode here. Let's select our ground, edit mode, and let's say we want to add another intersection, maybe rotate this one like around 90 degrees and maybe bring it also down. You can easily do that. And this one, what I just did, is going to be on every array from now on. So I don't have to select all of them separately on the entire room, just on one. So what I just did here, I would just select those here, and let's say those here, intersect, rotate, scale it down and bring it down. On all of them, I want them to be like this. And when I go through my scene, I can see that those are going to be also adjusted, which is awesome. Some of them I can maybe push in, others push out, just to have a little bit of randomness, which is pretty cool. And all I do is using very simple keys like I for intersect, I want it to be smaller, R for rotate, Z, so it only rotates on the Z axis, E to bring it in or out, extrude. I can give it different shapes if I want to. I can do whatever my little heart desires. That's why it's so important to set your lighting and your camera first, to see what are you actually going to be able to see, because you don't want to add details and put a lot of time and work into something you're not going to be able to see anyways. So just be aware of that spend your time wisely, but use those options, those things you can use, because it's pretty awesome. And it is pretty cool that I have those extra details here now. And we see those on the right as well. So every other one, I'm also gonna make something more interesting. I, intersect, E, let's say I again, E, and I added a little more detail there. Took me 5 seconds. And that is the final scene. It is very similar to the scene I made before, and please, if you make a scene based on my tutorial, please send it to me. I want to watch it, or post it on your Instagram or your YouTube. Send it to me. I want to watch it. I want to comment it, And because I do enjoy so much this community behind YouTube and my subscribership, my Patreons and my YouTube members, because that's super cool, the way we can create as a community, learning from each other, teaching each other. It just fascinates me. So if you got anything out of this video at all, please do me the favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next video. Toodaloo.